Welcome back, my rule-transcendent maverick. Something extraordinary is becoming clear to everyone who's been watching your trajectory. They believed they were allowing you to participate in their game, that they'd granted you permission to compete within the established framework they control. They set the boundaries, defined what success looks like, established the acceptable methods for achieving it, and you appeared to accept those terms, seemed to be playing along with their structure, looked like you were following the same playbook everyone else uses. But now, as results become undeniable and your position becomes unassailable, they're recognizing something that's simultaneously impressive and deeply unsettling. You were never actually playing by their rules. You understood their framework well enough to appear compliant, while actually operating according to completely different principles they never noticed, because they assumed everyone in their game follows the same fundamental logic. They let you play, thinking they'd contained you within boundaries they control. But you were playing entirely different game that just happened to take place in same space as theirs. The architects have been monitoring competitive dynamics and rule transcendence across civilizations for eons, and they've identified what you accomplished as parallel game mastery, when someone operates within established system while actually following different strategic framework that produces superior results, precisely because it's not constrained by limitations the official rules impose. Most people who enter competitive environments either follow established rules explicitly or break them, obviously, and face consequences. You did neither. You appeared to follow their rules while actually playing by principles they never articulated, because they don't understand those principles exist. This created perfect camouflage, where your non-compliance was invisible to those enforcing compliance because your results looked legitimate within their framework, even though methods were fundamentally different. Watch what's happening as they recognize you weren't playing their game. Officials who thought they understood your strategy are discovering they completely misread your approach. What they interpreted as conventional tactics executed were actually implementations of entirely different strategic framework. They lack concepts to understand. Competitors who thought they were competing against peer using same methods are realizing they were never in actual competition, because you weren't optimizing for same objectives or using same constraints they operate within. Observers who were tracking your progress using standard metrics are discovering those metrics don't capture what you actually achieved, because your real accomplishments exist in dimensions their measurement systems don't assess. Some people are experiencing cognitive dissonance trying to reconcile your apparent compliance with their framework and the emerging recognition that you weren't actually constrained by it. They saw you operate within their system, achieve results their system recognizes, advance through progression their structure defines. So how were you not playing by their rules? The answer is that you understood their rules well, enough to produce outputs they'd recognize as legitimate, while your actual process for generating those outputs followed completely different logic. You gave them what their system could measure while optimizing for objectives their system doesn't even recognize exist. The truly profound element is that they're discovering this limitation not because you revealed it, but because you're sustained. Superiority forced them to examine more carefully how you operate. If you'd been merely good within their framework, they'd never have looked closely enough to realize you're playing different game, but your consistent excellence at level that shouldn't be possible within their rule constraints forced them to investigate, and investigation revealed that their rules weren't actually constraining you because you never accepted those constraints as binding. You appeared to play their game as courtesy or camouflage, but your real game was always something they lack framework to fully comprehend. Now the architects are analyzing what enabled you to operate by different rules while appearing compliant with their framework, and they're identifying what they call meta-strategic awareness. You apparently understand not just the explicit rules of their game, but the deeper assumptions those rules rest on, and you've rejected the assumptions while maintaining appearance of following rules that derive from them. Most people who learn a game's rules internalize the underlying assumptions without questioning them, because rules and assumptions form unified worldview that feels like objective reality rather than constructed framework. You apparently maintained critical distance that allowed you to see their game as arbitrary construction rather than inevitable structure, giving you freedom to reject foundational assumptions while technically complying with surface rules. Watch what meta-strategic awareness enables practically. Their game assumes certain objectives are worth pursuing, certain constraints are unavoidable, certain trade-offs are necessary. You recognized these assumptions as choices rather than facts, allowing you to pursue different objectives, bypass assumed constraints, and avoid trade-offs they consider inherent to any serious strategy. When they see you achieve what should be impossible within their framework, they initially assume you're cheating or that you have resources they lack. Eventually, they realize you're not cheating and don't have special resources. You simply don't accept assumptions that make certain outcomes seem impossible within their worldview. Some game theorists and strategic analysts are recognizing that you've achieved what they call playing the metagame, competing not within established framework, but at level of frameworks themselves, choosing which game to play, while others assume the game is given. This meta-level operation gives you enormous advantage because you can select or create rules that favor your natural capabilities, while others are stuck playing games that might not suit their strengths. Because they don't realize game selection is option. You're not better at their game, you're better at choosing which game to play while making it appear you're playing theirs. Others are noting that you apparently understand incentive structures that created their rules, recognizing that rules weren't designed to enable optimal outcomes but to serve particular interests of those who established the framework. This understanding allows you to predict how rules will be enforced, which violations will be punished versus which will be ignored, where flexibility exists versus where boundaries are rigid. You're exploiting gaps between official rules and actual enforcement patterns, operating in ambiguous spaces that technically comply with rules while violating their spirit in ways enforcers can't easily address because their enforcement mechanisms target explicit violations rather than creative interpretations. A few sophisticated observers are recognizing that your approach demonstrates what philosophers call transcend and include. You haven't simply rejected their framework or broken their rules. You've transcended limitations their framework imposes while including aspects that remain useful. You operate at higher level of strategic sophistication that encompasses their game as limited case while having access to strategic options their framework excludes. This transcendent position makes you fundamentally unbeatable within their framework because you're not actually competing at their level. You're operating from level where their game is just one possible approach among many. The architects observe that meta-strategic awareness is rare because most people can't maintain critical distance from frameworks they operate within. They become so immersed in the game that they forget it's a game, treating its rules and assumptions as reality itself rather than as constructed system. You maintained that critical distance, possibly through natural inclination or through deliberate cultivation of perspective that sees all frameworks as contingent rather than necessary. This distance gave you freedom they lack, even though they thought they were free because they could make choices within their framework's boundaries. Something fascinating is spreading through your competitive environment now. What the architects call framework authority dissolution, where recognition that you achieved superiority while not actually playing by their rules is undermining confidence in framework itself among those who previously accepted it as legitimate structure for competition. If someone can transcend their rules while appearing to follow them and achieve better results through that transcendence, it raises uncomfortable questions about whether their framework is optimal or even necessary, whether its rules enable excellence or constrain it, whether its assumptions are accurate or merely conventional wisdom that no one questioned until you demonstrated alternatives work better. Watch how different stakeholders are responding to framework authority dissolution. True believers who are deeply invested in existing framework are experiencing cognitive dissonance. They've organized their understanding of competition around these rules and assumptions, built their strategies on framework's logic, defined their success through its metrics. Your transcendence threatens their entire worldview by demonstrating that framework they've centered their competitive life around is neither necessary nor optimal. Some respond with denial, insisting you must be following their rules in ways they haven't understood yet. Others respond with anger, claiming you're cheating, even when they can't identify specific rule violations. Some pragmatists who are following framework primarily because it seemed like only viable option are experiencing relief and excitement. They never fully bought into the assumptions but didn't see alternative until you demonstrated one exists. Your success gives them permission to question framework they'd accepted as inevitable, to explore whether they too might achieve better results by transcending rather than optimizing within existing boundaries. These pragmatists are studying your approach, trying to understand principles you operate by so they can adopt similar transcendent strategies. Others who benefit from existing framework are experiencing threat. They've achieved positions of advantage within current rules and worry that framework dissolution might eliminate their competitive edge. Perhaps they're naturally suited to compete well within existing constraints but wouldn't have advantages in more open competition. Perhaps they've accumulated framework-specific capital, knowledge of obscure rules, relationships with officials, resources valuable within current system but not beyond it, that would lose value if framework changes. These stakeholders become defensive of existing rules not because they believe framework is optimal but because they benefit from its limitations. A few reform-minded observers are using your transcendence as evidence for arguments they've been making about framework limitations. They've long believed the rules constrain excellence and enable mediocrity, that assumptions baked into framework are outdated or wrong. That structure should be revised to better enable optimal outcomes. Your success provides proof of concept for their reform proposals, giving them concrete example of superior results achieved through different approach. They're leveraging your transcendence as political tool for advancing changes they've advocated for years. The architects observe that framework authority dissolution triggered by your rule transcendence creates more lasting impact than merely winning within existing system would have achieved. If you dominated while clearly following their rules, you'd just be recognized as exceptional player of their game. By dominating while transcending their rules, you've revealed that their game itself is questionable, that perhaps everyone has been unnecessarily constrained by framework that could be rejected or transformed. This revelation doesn't just affect your competitive position, it potentially reshapes entire competitive environment by encouraging others to question and transcend limitations they'd previously accepted as inevitable. Now the architects are revealing what your rule transcendence demonstrates about relationship between freedom and mastery. You apparently achieved freedom from their constraints, not by ignorantly breaking rules, but by first mastering them thoroughly enough to understand which rules are enforced versus which are suggested, which assumptions are fundamental to framework versus which are conventional habits, where true boundaries exist versus where perceived boundaries reflect limited imagination rather than actual constraints. They call this informed transcendence, liberation that comes through understanding rather than through ignorance or rebellion. Consider how informed transcendence differs from simple rule-breaking. Naive rule breakers violate constraints without understanding consequences, getting punished for violations that don't provide strategic advantage. Rebellious rule breakers reject framework entirely, often failing to achieve results the framework recognizes as legitimate. You did neither. You understood their rules more thoroughly than those who enforced them, comprehended their framework more deeply than those who designed it, and used that comprehensive understanding to identify exactly which aspects you could transcend without triggering enforcement mechanisms while maintaining legitimacy within their system of recognition. Watch what this demonstrates about your development process. You didn't start by transcending their rules. You likely started by learning them, possibly even following them strictly while building comprehensive understanding of how framework operates. This mastery phase gave you knowledge base necessary for informed transcendence. Which rules protect essential fairness versus which merely preserve established interests, which constraints reflect genuine limits versus which reflect conventional thinking, which authorities must be respected versus which can be circumvented. This knowledge allows transcendence that looks like mastery rather than violation, making your rule transcendence nearly impossible to punish because you're not technically breaking rules despite clearly operating beyond their constraints. Some martial arts and spiritual traditions teach similar progression. You must first master the form before you can transcend the form. Must learn rules thoroughly before earning freedom from them. Must demonstrate complete understanding of conventional approach before innovating beyond it. Your competitive journey, apparently, followed this pattern, whether deliberately or intuitively, building foundation of mastery that enables and legitimizes your current transcendence. You earned right to transcend by first proving you understand what you're transcending. Others note that informed transcendence requires particular personality configuration. You need discipline to master conventional approach even when you can see its limitations, wisdom to recognize that premature transcendence fails while mastery-based transcendence succeeds, patience to progress through stages rather than jumping directly to transcendence. You haven't earned foundation for. Many people who see framework limitations attempt to skip mastery phase and jump directly to transcendence, failing because they lack understanding necessary to transcend effectively. You apparently had discipline and patience to progress through full developmental sequence. A few are recognizing that your transcendence might not be final state, but could be transitional, phase toward even higher mastery. Perhaps, having transcended their framework, you'll eventually transcend your current framework as you continue developing, finding limitations in your current approach that will motivate next level of transcendence. This suggests mastery is not static achievement, but ongoing process of understanding frameworks, transcending their limitations, developing new frameworks, recognizing their limitations, and continuing spiral of deepening sophistication. The architects observe that informed transcendence explains why they let you play. You demonstrated sufficient mastery of their framework that allowing you to participate seemed safe. They didn't realize that your mastery was foundation for transcendence rather than indication of compliance, that your understanding of their rules enabled you to operate beyond those rules while maintaining appearance of legitimate participation. By the time they recognized you weren't actually playing by their rules, your position was already unassailable because you'd achieved results their system recognizes as legitimate through methods their system can't regulate because they operate at meta level their enforcement mechanisms don't reach. The architects are now analyzing the psychological impact on competitors who are realizing they've been trying to beat you at game you weren't actually playing, and they're identifying what they call competitive futility, recognition, the demoralizing awareness that all their strategic effort was misdirected because they were optimizing for success within framework that didn't constrain you, preparing for competition that wasn't actually occurring, trying to master game while you were transcending it. This recognition undermines not just their confidence about competing with you specifically, but their understanding of competition generally. Watch what competitive futility recognition creates psychologically. Your competitors invested significant resources developing expertise in their game, learning advanced strategies, refining execution, building capabilities that would provide advantages within established framework. They competed fiercely against each other for dominance within that framework, treating each other as serious rivals whose challenge required maximum effort. Meanwhile, you are operating according to different logic entirely, making their fierce competition with each other irrelevant to actual hierarchy because you were never included in competition they thought they were having. Some competitors are experiencing anger about wasted effort. They could have been developing different capabilities or pursuing different objectives if they'd realized conventional framework could be transcended. Instead, they optimized their development for competition that didn't include the most important player because that player was operating at different level entirely. This anger isn't necessarily directed at you. Some recognize you did nothing wrong by transcending limitations, but it's anger at their own limited vision that kept them confined within framework while you operated freely. Others are questioning their competitive philosophy entirely. If they were wrong about fundamental assumptions underlying their strategic approach, what else might they be wrong about? This existential questioning extends beyond just this specific competition to their general approach to challenges and goals. They're reconsidering whether they should continue optimizing within established frameworks, or whether they should develop capability to recognize and transcend limitations like you apparently can. This questioning is uncomfortable, but potentially valuable if it leads to genuine development of meta-strategic awareness. A few competitors are experiencing depression or learned helplessness, recognizing they lack cognitive sophistication or psychological freedom to transcend frameworks the way you do, concluding they'll always be limited to competing within boundaries while players like you compete at meta level. This fatalistic response is least productive because it prevents them from attempting development that might enable their own transcendence, accepting limitation as permanent when it might be surmountable through patient cultivation of meta-strategic awareness. The architects observed that competitive futility recognition reveals how rule transcendence doesn't just give you advantage in specific competition. It creates qualitative difference in competitive level that makes conventional competition irrelevant. You're not just better at their game, you're playing different game entirely that encompasses and transcends theirs. Competitors who optimize within framework are competing with each other for best position within that framework, but that entire competition is subordinate to metagame where you're choosing which framework to operate in. They're competing to be best player while you've transcended the player role entirely by becoming someone who selects or creates games rather than just playing them. They let you play because they thought you were a participant in their competition, not recognizing you were never competing at their level but operating at meta level where their framework is just one possible option you chose to engage with while maintaining freedom to transcend at any moment. Now something's emerging that the architects call rule creator recognition. observers are realizing that you're not just transcending their rules, but potentially defining new framework that others might adopt, shifting from being subject of existing rules to being creator of new rules that could reshape competitive landscape. This transformation from rule follower to rule creator represents fundamental shift in power and authority that extends beyond your individual competitive advantage to potentially restructuring how competition operates for everyone in your domain. Watch how rule creator recognition manifests across different groups. Thought leaders and innovators who recognize patterns early are studying your approach, trying to understand principles behind your rule transcendence so they can articulate them as new framework others might follow. They're attempting to reverse engineer your meta-strategic awareness into teachable methodology to transform what you discovered or intuited into explicit system that can be transmitted to others. If they succeed, you become originator of new competitive paradigm that others adopt, cementing your historical importance beyond your individual achievements. Some institutional authorities who control official frameworks are considering whether to adapt existing rules to account for your approach or to resist your transcendence as threat to their authority. Progressive authorities recognize that frameworks should evolve as competitors discover their limitations, and they're exploring how to update rules to enable legitimate innovations. Your transcendence represents while preventing destructive abuses of framework flexibility. Conservative authorities fear that legitimizing your transcendence would undermine their control, preferring to maintain existing framework even if it's suboptimal rather than allowing framework evolution. They might not be able to control. Others who've achieved success within existing framework are experiencing status anxiety. If your transcendent approach becomes new standard, their conventional excellence might be revealed as limited mastery of outdated framework. Rather than genuine sophistication, they have personal investment in maintaining existing rules because their expertise and achievements are defined relative to those rules. If framework shifts toward principles you operate by, they might lose competitive advantage they've worked years to develop within conventional system. A few visionaries are recognizing that your rule transcendence isn't necessarily endpoint, but could be beginning of ongoing framework evolution. If you can transcend current rules and establish new ones, someone might eventually transcend your framework and establish yet newer rules. This suggests dynamic, competitive landscape where frameworks continuously evolve as innovative competitors discover limitations of existing rules and create better alternatives. You're not final answer, but important milestone in ongoing progression toward increasingly sophisticated competitive frameworks. The architects observe that rule creator recognition transforms you from exceptional player to potential paradigm founder, someone whose approach could define how competition operates for extended period and across broad population. Most competitive excellence is forgotten. Once the person retires, they were best within framework that continues unchanged after they're gone. But if you succeed in establishing new framework that others adopt, your influence persists indefinitely because framework itself carries your innovations forward. Even when you're no longer active competitor, they let you play, thinking you'd be constrained by their rules, not recognizing you'd transcend those rules so thoroughly that you might establish new rules that replace theirs entirely. Something profound is crystallizing now that the architects call recognition of assumed constraint fallacy. Your rule transcendence is revealing that many limitations people accept as inherent to competition or reality are actually just unquestioned assumptions that seem inevitable only because no one challenges them. This recognition extends beyond your specific domain to general principle that might apply across many areas. What people call rules of the game are often just conventions that appear permanent until someone demonstrates alternatives work better. Consider how many constraints people accept without questioning. In every domain, participants inherit framework from predecessors, assumptions about what's possible, trade-offs that seem necessary, boundaries that appear fixed. Most people optimize within these inherited constraints, competing to achieve best possible outcomes given assumed limitations. You apparently questioned fundamental constraints, tested whether they're actually necessary or just conventional, discovered that many supposed rules are preferences that can be rejected once you realize rejecting them is option. Watch how this recognition is spreading beyond your immediate competitive environment. Observers in other domains are asking whether their own fields have similar assumed constraints that could be transcended, whether limitations they've accepted as inherent are actually just conventions that no one questions because questioning seems impractical or impossible. Your example provides proof of concept that transcending assumed constraints is viable strategy rather than naive impossibility, encouraging explorers across many fields to test boundaries they'd previously accepted as fixed. Some innovation theorists are connecting your approach to historical examples of paradigm shifts, moments when someone demonstrated that assumed constraints weren't actually binding, enabling revolutionary rather than incremental progress. They recognize you as potential paradigm shifter whose transcendence could enable breakthrough that reorganizes entire domain around new understanding of what's possible. Whether your specific transcendence proves that significant remains to be seen, but pattern matches historical examples of transformative innovations that emerged from questioning fundamental assumptions. Others note that assumed constraint fallacy creates self-fulfilling prophecy. Because everyone believes certain limitations are real, no one attempts to transcend them, which reinforces belief that limitations are real. Because no one succeeds in transcending them, this creates stable but suboptimal equilibrium where framework persists despite being suboptimal because everyone's behavior confirms its necessity. You broke this equilibrium by acting as if constraints weren't real, discovering through experiment that many weren't, and demonstrating to others that transcendence is possible once someone proves it through example. A few are exploring how to identify which constraints are genuine versus which are assumed, developing criteria for distinguishing fundamental limits that can't be transcended from conventional limits that merely seem permanent because they're widely accepted. This meta-analysis of constraints themselves could enable more systematic identification of transcendence opportunities across many domains, multiplying impact of your example beyond your specific competitive domain to general methodology for recognizing and transcending unnecessary limitations. The architects observe that recognition of assumed constraint fallacy might be most valuable. Contribution of your rule, transcendence, not just your specific competitive advantages, but demonstration of general principle that constraints often reflect limited imagination rather than actual necessity. If your example encourages broad questioning of assumed limits across many domains, your impact extends far beyond your individual achievements to catalyzing wave of innovation as people realize they're unnecessarily constrained by conventions they mistook for natural laws. They let you play by their rules, but you showed them their rules were never as binding as everyone assumed, opening possibility that other supposed necessities might also be optional once someone questions them seriously.